It's been a few years, and I've tried to give you some new material here too. So today, as an outline, we're going to talk a little bit about bacterial meningitis. And I'm going to focus a little bit today about updates on some of these things because, as you know, there's thousands of pathogens that can potentially give neuroinfectious diseases, and I'm going to pick 5. Okay, so please don't be insulted if I didn't pick your favorite one. But I'm happy to take any questions afterwards. So we're talking a little bit about bacterial meningitis in the beginning. Again, a little bit of emphasis on updates. Encephalitis with a little bit more about herpes simplex, since that's generally the number one. And then maybe a little bit about the approach to encephalitis and how we might tackle all this. And then I'm going to finish with progressive multifocal encephalopathy, which is doesn't really fit the other 2 categories, but I think has been of growing interest to neurologists. So I've tried to pick the ones that I get a lot of questions on our Neuro ID service. And just as a reminder, for acute bacterial meningitis, there's actually 2 guidelines. There's one from our Infectious Disease Society of America, and this is actually a little bit dated, 2004, and I know people are working on this. And then there's one from the European Society of Clinical Microinfectious Diseases, which is very good. And this was updated in 2016. And there's a lot of similarities, some differences here as well. And we'll get right to this. This is what we're talking about in the beginning. We'll spend a few minutes about purulent bacterial meningitis. Now, for question 1, we'll get right to it. Which of the following is false regarding meningococcal meningitis? A, there's a current outbreak of meningococcal meningitis, mainly in gay and bisexual men. B, patients receiving Equilizumab or Soliris are at high risk for meningococcal meningitis. C, purpura fulminans is a known complication. And D, ciprofloxacin is now considered the treatment of choice. And please key in your answers. Oh, it keeps moving. Okay. Okay. Very good. The answer is D, ciprofloxacin is the treatment of choice. And I'll go through each of these as they go through our slides here. So still there are several which are, despite some changes in the epi, are still very common. So Strep Pneumoniae. In the United States, this is still the league leader, so you're around 70% of the cases. Niceria Meningitis, depending on the age, is roughly 12% if you look at all comers. And then Listeria monocytogenes is about 4%, and it's variable. And we'll come back and spend a little time on this one. And then Strep agalactiae, group B strep, is a few percent. So if you divvy it down by the ages, and there's many of these types of analyses, but basically I find it most interesting to do less than 60 and greater than 60. And as you can see, Strep pneumo still leads things despite changing in epi. Neisseria is highly age dependent, 20% if you're less than 60, 3%. Listeria, almost the opposite, 20% if you're over 60. And then this is a little bit variable depending on what country is in. Group B strep usually in very patients with obesity, liver disease, etc. So I wanted to go just a word on meningococcal meningitis. Oops. So meningococcal meningitis, this is a patient I had. It's characterized by a lot of strokes. So this is a very stroke-like, high mortality infection. Hydrocephalus is actually not that uncommon. Cerebral edema is also quite common. And in one series, over 20% of patients with pneumococcal meningitis had arterial complications. And in my opinion, that's low. And the second one, though, that I want to spend a little more time on that hopefully is relevant to you as neurologists is Niceria Meningitis. Purpura fulminans is one of the questions we had, but this is a patient with purpura fulminans, which actually is a microvascular thrombotic disorder, which really, it isn't entirely unique to Niceria meningitis, but this is usually what your patients will die from if they have meningococcal meningitis, or limb loss, and it's a combination of sluggish circulation, a variety of different other cytokines that will lead to these really, really extensive thromboses. And in Europe, often your outcomes will be measured not just by death, but your secondary outcomes is by limb loss. Oops. So, meningococcal meningitis. Now, this is the only one that really comes out in outbreaks. Things like pneumococcus and some of these other ones don't really come out in outbreaks. And there is a vaccine that's been around for years. So many of you will have your kids will have had the standard serogroup quadrivalent. So those are the serogroups W, A, C, and Y. And 12 years old is your pediatrician will give it, and then another 16 before they go to college. But this was interesting. In 2013 to 2015, there were 5 college campuses in the United States where there were outbreaks of meningitis from group B, which is not in the WACY. And in fact, this wasn't just one college. This was Stanford. This is West Coast, East Coast. People didn't really understand what happened. And then they went to the national stockpile of serogroup B, which were in the military, and those were what were used. And now this was launched more commercially in 2014 and 15, and is part of our series now. And another update is some of you may be using these because one of them is called Equilizumab or Soliris. That was 2007. And then Ravulizumab, which was came out 2018. And these are complement blockers. So they act at the level of C5. And here's your typical complement pathway, the lectin, classical and alternate pathway. And without going through all the details, they all kind of converge down various pathways to the C5, and when you use these drugs, they will block past C5, and you wind up with problems with terminal attack complex. So what was it actually used for? So originally it was for hematologic problems, so a typical hemolytic anemias, PNH, paroxysmal nocturnal hemoglobinuria, but there are now FDA approvals, and maybe some of you have been using this for myasthenia gravis and neuromyelitis optica spectrum disorders. And these are all, you have to have serological positive for aquaporin 4 for these. And others, in fact, if you look at the literature, these are the ones that are FDA approved. There's many, many which are at least being examined. So this problem is going to just get bigger. The problem is you have a 1,000 to 2,000 increase in the incidence of meningococcal infection. And it's got, of course, a black box warning for some years. And you have to be a special prescriber and go through all this training in order to give these 2 drugs. So what's thought to happen is we should be giving the patients that quadrivalent one, WACY, but also the serogroup B or Men B vaccines. And also, this has changed a little bit.